Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate that. Yet another set of acronyms and expenses and costs. It seems we're spending a lot of money today on some of these compliance obligations. So with that very positive note, I will turn it over again to Jordan Kislear, who was on our panel this morning, and he's going to talk to us today about UIC Class 2 and Class 6 applications for carbon capture and sequestration, which I almost got a question out about on the panel, so I may yet reserve the right to ask that at the end of his presentation. So, Jordan.
All right, thanks a lot. Seems like there's a little bit of a lag from when I click the button until it goes forward. Or maybe I just need to point it in the right... Oh, there it goes. Okay. So I guess, okay, there we go. Again, my name is Jordan Kislear. I'm with the Department of Energy. So today I wanted to talk about underground injection control Class 6 wells. So I wanted to just go over what the wells are, why I'm talking about this today, how does it even impact everybody here, discuss the difference between Class 2 and Class 6 wells, and there's some important nuances on how they work right now, especially with regards to the 111B regulations for the new plants. Not so much for the existing sources, but it really kind of impacts the new plants. Talk about some recent actions, and then talk about, it's actually very timely because we just got two draft permits out of EPA, one for Archer Daniels Midland. They have a plant in Decatur, Illinois, and a second permit for FutureGen, which is also in Illinois, so conveniently both in Region 5. So what is the UIC program? So it was part of the part of the Safe Drinking Water Act that was issued back in 1974, which sets federal regulations which ensure adequate protection of underground sources of drinking water. The United States is it's a little bit different than the rest of the world. We protect groundwater up to 10,000 parts per million. Parts of Europe protect up to 5,000 ppm. So we're a little bit more protective than other parts. And what the UIC program does is it regulates anything that gets injected, any fluid that gets injected into the subsurface. And the entire thrust of this is to protect groundwater. That's the entire reason that this act exists. That's the entire context. But it's also used for other things such as enhanced oil recovery or just normal oil recovery, or just anything that's injected in the subsurface. There are a couple of things that are exempted. Most notably is hydraulic fracturing fluids are exempted, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. We're not exempted when we do geologic storage of CO2. And that's why we did Class 6, because we wanted to make sure that we knew how those regulations work and make sure that we get ahead of the regulatory front before we really start injecting large volumes of CO2. So this is just a quick diagram of the 6 different classes of wells. Over here on the left, Class 1 is hazardous injection wells. Anything is a hazardous waste that's a liquid that you inject in the subsurface. I don't actually know the exact depth, but there's a certain minimum depth that you can inject at. Class 2 is anything for oil and gas production, so that's production, enhanced oil recovery, if you're injecting water for secondary recovery, or even CO2 for tertiary recovery. That's all covered under Class 2, as well as, I believe, wastewater injections from produced waters. All of that is under Class 2. Class 3 is salt solution mining, so if you're looking for some bromine, that would probably fall under Class 3. Class 4 was a section that was created, and there were a few shallow hazardous wells that were created. So EPA created a new category, said you can't do those anymore, threw those wells into the class and said, no more, don't do it. Class 5 is the experimental wells, and for a large portion of our program, we had most of our projects permitted under either Class 1 as a hazardous injection or under Class 5. Actually, turns out most of our Class 1 injection wells did end up complying with the Class 6 regulations, which were just developed. And Class 6 is, I guess, right here in the middle. And for some reason, Class 5 is over on the right on this diagram, but they do weird things sometimes. So Class 6 is our new well. It's specifically for geologic storage of CO2. You can put it into deep saline reservoirs, which are more than 10,000 ppm total dissolved solids, or it actually can be used for enhanced oil recovery when it's used in a storage mode. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. So why did they develop Class 6 regulations? CO2, when you're injecting in the subsurface, has some pretty different characteristics than a lot of the other things that have been regulated. It's extremely large volumes. I mean, for a 500 megawatt coal-fired power plant operating at about 80% capacity, fairly new, I'd say about 40% efficient, you're talking about 3 to 3.5 million tons of CO2 per year. And if you're capturing 90% of that CO2 and putting it in the ground, that's a huge, huge volume. It's that's quite different than the volumes that we're talking about under the USC program traditionally. It's also buoyant. If you inject CO2 into the ground, it naturally wants to rise up. The way that the reservoirs are created, CO2 wants to go to the top. So how do you regulate that? How do you ensure that it doesn't go anywhere? How do you make sure you know where it's going to go? Because it's actually very mobile. It wants to go throughout the formation and to a certain extent. And then you have to have your pressure front that you need to track as well. So how do you make sure that all of that is adequately protective? And it's corrosive to some of the materials that we use in some of the well packing. So that's why we've developed the USC program. So we went through a number of things, we being DOE with EPA. EPA developed the entire program, but we had a lot of the expertise on the ground with some of our projects that we could offer while we were developing the regulations. So a number of things that were instituted in this regulation, making sure you can adequately characterize your site. How do you know what the formation looks like? Do you have to do seismic monitoring, groundwater monitoring? Really, how do you, what types of things do you look for when you're looking for a strong storage site? And actually under the Recovery Act, we received about $50 million to go through and do 10 different sites that we just did the characterization of the reservoir. So we did provide a lot of that information back to EPA, and they used that to strengthen portions of the regulation. How do you calculate the area of review? What types of modeling programs do you use? Do you do seismic? Well construction, how should you build them? Operation, site monitoring, which ended up being a big part of this regulation, is after you've closed the well, what do you do afterwards? How do you make sure that it's adequately protective? How do you make sure that your company is responsible for the CO2 that's down there? And what happens in the event of any unfortunate accidents, if there's remediation needed, what does that look like? How do we write that into the regulations? Public participation, financial responsibility, site closure, all these things were things that specifically had to be thought about just for the Class 6 regulations. I got the double tap there. So right now, as I mentioned earlier, Class 2 regulations are still used for enhanced oil recovery. So if you're injecting CO2 to help the mobility of oil, a lot of our projects are still operating under Class 2 regulations. But again, it doesn't cover hydraulic fracturing, just want to mention that. And then the Class 6 wells, which are the new class of wells, is just for the geologic storage in the deep areas. It was finalized in December of 2010, has very strong reporting, monitoring, and verification methods. I'll get back to that in a minute. And we just received 2 of our first permits, and I'll actually have some nice pictures so that everybody doesn't fall asleep through my slides of just words. So under the permits, we have a number of different documents that need to be submitted for each individual well that's permitted. First and foremost, operating and reporting conditions. There's a very large part of this is just about reporting. How much CO2 do you have? How much are you injecting? And especially looking at the monitoring plan is if you detect any leaks, really making sure you know how much CO2 you're actually storing in the subsurface. Second part is area review and corrective action plan. So if there is a leak, if you do detect that the groundwater has been affected, what do you do? What type of mitigation activities do you have? Do you have to do anything specifically to the formation itself to mitigate the mobility of the CO2? Do you have to do some groundwater remediation? And all that stuff is covered in the AOR and the corrective action plan. Testing and monitoring plan, mostly that's the groundwater monitoring. We also have some far field wells that are required under the regulation. So when you calculate the CO2 that you're injecting, you naturally have a plume of CO2 that actually moves. But you also have a pressure front because the formation water that's out in front of the CO2 is pressurized slightly. So you also have to measure and monitor the pressure front. So you have to have separate far field monitoring wells that you use. Injection well plugging plan, how do you close the well? Post-injection site care and site closure plan. That's one of the bigger ones that a lot of folks were very concerned about. Right now in the regulations, anybody that applies for a permit has to look at a 50-year post-injection site characterization plan, which that's actually pretty scary for a lot of people. I mean, 50 years ago was, oh geez, what are we in, 2014? 50 years ago, we were still building some of these power plants, which we're now retiring. So we're saying 50 years after you close the well, you're still going to be responsible for the CO2 that you put in the ground. It's pretty scary. So that's part of the reason the plan was developed is how do you make sure that the company is responsible for the CO2? How do you make sure that if anything occurs in the future, that those remediation activities can be taken? One of the nice things is that of our 2 first permits, ADM actually is only injecting for, I believe, 3 years, and they submitted information to get a 10-year post-injection site care waiver. So far, it looks like it's actually going to go through, so I was actually very pleased with that. And that was actually something that we had a lot of negotiation with EPA, and at the end of the day, they said, well, as long as you can show that you know where it's going to be in 10 years, and you show that there's no potential harm after those 10 years, then we'll grant the waiver. But they wanted to be very strong and say 50 years is the default. And for right now, I think FutureGen, even though they're injecting for 10 years, they have signed up for the 50-year post-injection site care period. After that, quality assurance and surveillance plan. How do you know that the people who are logging the data are certified, and that how do you know that the data is accurate? Emergency and remedial response. That's actually a little bit closer to the seismic response plan. So if there's any type of seismic activity, what do you do? Do you just shut down immediately? Because if you just back off that pressure, you might get some negative effects. What is that threshold? At what seismic level do you have to notify different people? I have some examples of that a little bit later. Extraction details, financial assurance demonstration. That's one of the other bigger ones. Is how do you make sure that you know what your company is going to be responsible for this project into the future, not just today. What happens if you go bankrupt in 2 years? Well, you want to make sure that you're financially responsible for everything. And then the stimulation program plan. That's another smaller one. There's some concern that a few formations might need a little bit of extra help to get the CO2 to move in them. The first 2 permits don't actually have a stimulation plan. So this kind of dovetails a little bit with the greenhouse gas reporting requirements. Right now, any CO2 that's used either for geologic storage or for enhanced oil recovery has to report under the greenhouse gas reporting framework. Class 6 and there's another category called Subpart RR have to report all of this information. You have to report where did you get your CO2, how much did you get. You have to develop an EPA approved site plan for reporting and monitoring and verification. So you have to essentially do a mass balance on the CO2 that you're getting. So you have to figure out how much you're getting, how much you're injecting, and if any leaks, how much is there. And you have to report all that information back to EPA. All Class 6 facilities must report under this Subpart RR, but there's another part called Subpart UU, which that's what most of the enhanced oil recovery facilities report under right now. You pretty much have to just say, here's how much CO2 we get, and if you know where it comes from, where does it come from? That's it. That's all you have to report. And one of the issues that's come up recently is that, here we go, under Section 111B of the Clean Air Act, any CO2 that's removed from a coal-fired power plant must be sent to a facility that reports under Subpart RR, which is essentially what this says in the preamble up here at the top. So you essentially have 2 options if you're going to have a capture system and you want to comply with 111B. You have to either have a Class 6 well or you have to have a Class 2 facility reporting under RR. We did get a number of comments out from industry that we saw on this one. First and foremost is that nobody reports under Subpart RR right now. So you can make the argument that the reporting requirements are not adequately demonstrated, and that argument has been made and will be continued to be made by many people. Denbury in particular has a very strong position paper out on this, and they say it changes from a resource recovery, I forgot the Y, to a waste management operation. And that's one of their major concerns is they don't want to be responsible for the CO2. They just don't want EPA to encroach on it. And they've actually come out and said they will not be taking any more anthropogenic CO2. Now, whether the market conditions change and whether we start seeing a lot of CO2 being captured from coal-fired power plants and then the price drops to $2 instead of, I think it's about $30 to $40 right now, maybe they'll change their position. It's hard to say right now, but it's something that we're going to be watching going forward. And most people are just really concerned with that additional reporting requirements. They don't have to do it now. It fundamentally changes what they do. And according to EPA's best guess, I think it adds 3 to 4% onto their operating costs just for enhanced oil recovery facilities. So something to watch in the future is just to watch how this kind of plays out. Another thing that we're contending with is the RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Sorry, I'm really bad with acronyms too. They issued what's called a categorical exclusion. So under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, they are responsible for the management of any solid waste. And essentially, they said, hey, look, CO2 is adequately permitted at the power plant under the 111B, so you've got your air permit. It's permitted in your pipeline under the Department of Transportation pipeline standards, and now it's permitted under Class 6 whenever you inject the CO2 into the subsurface. So the RCRA office said, look, we don't have a role to play in here. We're going to grant this exclusion. We don't want to touch it. They've already been sued. They said, look, here's the problem is that you inject it as a fluid, but when it reacts in the subsurface, it actually becomes a solid. So this is something that we need to watch going forward. It's partly of a concern, but essentially one office of the EPA doesn't want to deal with it, and they're trying to get themselves out of it. So this is kind of a little bit of a corner they backed themselves into. So also something to watch going forward. So here we go. The permit process. Right now, what you need to do is draft your permit, submit everything to EPA, and then there's usually a back and forth between the permitter and the permittee to make sure that all of the information is submitted back to EPA. Once all of that is done and a draft permit is issued, then the public comment period is open. And this is actually where we are right now with both of our permits. They were issued in early April of this year. So right now the public comment period is open for 45 days. 2 public hearings were held, one for FutureGen, one for ADM. I think 6 people attended each of the meetings. Not very noteworthy in the communities. So after this, what will happen is EPA will receive all of their comments back. They'll take a look at them, and if there are any appeals, then they need to be lodged with EPA and kind of work their way through the EPA Court of Appeals, essentially. They'll then issue the final decision and grant the final permit. We expect those to be in about September or October of this year, depending on the timing. Once the projects get their final permit, what they have is what's called an authorization to construct, which means they can actually drill the well. Once they drill the well, they have to go down to the formation where they're injecting, gather some more data, do some fluid sampling, measure the temperature, measure the pressure, submit that back to EPA and say, hey, here's what we measured, here's what we modeled, and if there are any changes, then they'll kind of go back and renegotiate the permit. Once that's all completed, you've got your well drilled, you case it, and you complete it. Now you can begin injection. So the permit will be modified to authorize the injection, and then the projects will be on their way. So with ADM, which is the one that will be probably the first one to start injecting, they're expecting to get their permit in September. Hold on. Let me go that. Okay, they should get their permit in September, drill the well this fall, and then early next year they should get the authorization to inject. As long as they get their authorization by March, then they should be good to meet the 45Q tax credit. I'll get back to that in a second. So we've had a lot of experience in the Department of Energy doing a number of small-scale field tests. Well, I'm sorry, these are actually the large-scale field tests. We've done about 8 projects that injected about 1 million tons per year. We've had a mixture of Class 1 and Class 5 permits, as I mentioned earlier. One that I want to point out is this one right here, the Midwest Geologic Sequestration Partnership, and they are injecting into the Mount Simon Formation. They're actually on the ADM property right now, and they're injecting at about 1,000 tons per day. They do have a Class 1 permit. They're authorized to inject up to 1 million tons, and they're actually getting pretty close. This one's, this line might be a month or 2 old. I think they're almost up to 900,000 tons now, but they should be hitting 1 million tons later this year. So we use a lot of this information, help DPA to develop their permit process. Tom Sarkis will be talking a lot more about our demonstration projects. This is just a highlight of them. The 2 in purple, which are FutureGen and Archer Daniels Midland, right here in Region 5, next to each other, actually have very similar lithography. They do have Class 6 permits. All the rest of these in green all have some type of Class 2 permit. Now, the plants themselves don't actually have the Class 2 permits. Usually their partner that they're selling CO2 to has the permit. So just wanted to point out the Class 6 is still fairly new. We don't have a whole lot of experience, but we got the 2 draft permits out so people can start taking a look at them. Archer Daniels Midland, again, Tom will talk a little bit more about this later. CO2 is captured from an ethanol facility. It's actually not even really captured. It's already separated out as part of the process. They do biologic production of ethanol from corn. So, I mean, it's essentially like a big, if anybody brews beer, you throw some yeast in and you react it and everything like that. So CO2 is a pretty pure byproduct. They dewater it, they put it into some compressors and then compress it and then they put it down whole. So They're about 65% done with construction. I visited the site back in January when I was kind of poking and prodding them to get all their permit stuff in, and it's actually quite impressive. I mean, the compressors are really huge. They've got their pipelines all built. They've got the substations all up. It's a pretty neat project. They got their draft. They did get their draft permit, and now I get to start talking about some of the exciting pictures. Down here is the actual ADM facility in lovely Decatur, Illinois. It smells pretty terrible if you go there because it's all corn byproducts and corn stover and all kinds of stuff. So right now they've got their first initial compression facility down here in this blue, and they're going up here to CCS, what they call CCS1, and that was the million ton per year or million ton project that they've got going. They've got two different wells. They've got a geologic monitoring well here in this tiny little green box, and they've got a verification well here in the yellow. So what they're planning to do is they're going to connect this pipeline up with a second compression facility here in purple, and they're going to truck it up here a little bit further up to CCS2, which is the Class 6 permit that they've applied for. One thing to mention is that each individual well is permitted when they do this. So this well will be permitted Class 6. This well actually meets all the requirements of Class 6, but it's still permitted under Class 1. They're not going to convert it over for something that I'll talk about in just a second. So they've got their verification well 2, which is a little bit further, you notice, than verification well for number 1. Reason for that is their pressure front is a little bit further. They've got seismic wells, and they've got all kinds of measurement verification a little bit further out. Here's another view, and this is the modeling that they did for this project. So starting from the inside, this is actually the injection well right here, this tiny little symbol. The yellow part is the plume front that they expect to have in 2070. The purple is the pressure front that they see in 2070, and the green represents their area review, which encompasses where they expect the pressure front to be all the way out in 2070. So this is their best modeling. This is where they think the CO2 is going to go. And the other interesting thing to mention is, I'm sorry, this is CCS1 here. CCS2 is, this is their injection well, wait, right there, that one in green. What's interesting is that they're actually going to use CCS1 as one of their monitoring wells. So they actually had some negotiation with EPA at the very end of the project. Originally, they were planning to inject in the same formation into the lower Mount Simon formation, but over time, a lot of the particulars of the project changed, and they're now actually injecting in the upper Mount Simon formation. They have, let me go a little bit further really quick. They have what's called a stacked formation in Illinois, which is actually very convenient. So they've got 4 different sandstone formations, each of which is overlaid by a cap rock. So it's probably one of the best geologies that you could possibly get in the country. Let me go back here. So CCS1 injected very deep into the Mount Simon formation. Originally, they were planning to inject and see some plume interaction between the two CO2 plumes, but because the timings didn't work out, they actually started injecting in the upper Mount Simon formation, or will start injecting for CCS2. So they're going to use the CCS1 well as a groundwater monitoring well, which is way up here in the St. Peter sandstone, which is their lowermost source of drinking water. Okay. The other thing that I want to mention is their seismic monitoring plan. So this was very tightly negotiated with EPA, and I know that the wording is a little bit small, but I think the slides should all be available afterwards. This is also directly from the permit that's posted on the website. So they actually have a 5-tier approach for different types of seismic events, and they range from seismic events less than or equal to magnitude 1.5, which is you can measure it, but you can't really feel it. That's like a truck driving past on the road by your house. It's there and you can see it, but it's not really going to affect you. It's not going to rattle your walls. And then all the way up to red, which is a seismic event of magnitude greater than 3.5. So they're doing everything they possibly can to avoid this, including injecting at 80% of the reservoir pressure, and they're really trying to monitor it as good as they can. And they have a pretty tight response plan, which includes things like reporting back to the Illinois State Geologic Service, reporting to the U.S. Geologic Service, and then they actually have a hotline so that if you suspect that there is any seismic activity that's being caused by this project, you can actually call ADM and say, hey, what's going on? What can you tell us? And they have a person standing by so that they can review the well logs and make sure that everything looks okay. So they're doing everything they can to be adequately protective of both the groundwater and the seismic situation locally in Decatur, Illinois. The other project, which I think is also very interesting, is the FutureGen project. It's a repowering of it's currently an Ameren facility. They're looking at a 168 megawatt oxy-combustion project. So it will capture about 1,000 tons per year. They're working towards getting financial closure, but it's kind of a chicken and egg thing because they needed to have the draft permit for their Class 6 facility before they got their financial closure. Part of the Class 6 permit was you have to show that you're financially responsible for the project after it goes. So what do? You don't have the permit, so you can't get the money, but you don't have the money, so you can't get the permit. So they ended up putting about $2.7 million into a trust fund to show that they have a financial responsiveness throughout the life of the project. As I mentioned earlier, they've actually applied for the 50-year post-injection site care, although they're only injecting for about 10 years. The interesting part about this project is they're located in Morgan County in Illinois. They're way over here by the border is where the plant is, and then about 30 miles away is where they're injecting. So it's actually, the pipeline is actually going underneath a whole bunch of farmland. They've gotten the right-of-way from practically every farm, I think, except one. They don't want to, but they can use eminent domain if they have to. It's a long story. If you really want to hear about it, we'll talk later. But the cool thing is that the reservoir that they're injecting into is also the Mount Simon Formation, which I think I mentioned earlier. Decatur would be way over here on the right side of the map, and FutureGen's over here. It's an anticline. It slopes upward towards FutureGen. So they're a whole lot shallower. So this is where they're planning to inject about 3,000 feet, whereas ADM is way over here at about 4,000 feet. But what's important is that this pressure of the reservoir is actually what determines a lot of their compression facility way back at the power plant. They're doing an oxy-combustion, and they're recirculating the CO2 in the system, so it comes out as 90% pure. So you have to build a compression facility, and they base the end of the compressors based on the formation pressure where they're injecting, which I think is actually fairly novel. So they've got the formation pressure kind of comes up, you got the wellhead, and then it goes through a 30-mile pipeline back to the plant. There's valving and everything, so you can turn it off, but that's essentially how they designed that portion of the plant. Sorry, I keep bouncing back and forth a little bit. So here's the lithography again, stack formation as we talked about. The Eau Claire is their primary confining zone, injecting in the Mount Simon Formation. I already went over this a little bit. It'll be available on the website if you want to look at it. This is the one I really think this is my favorite slide of my entire presentation. This is the well map that they have for FutureGen. So right now, they're planning on 4 different injection wells, each of which is individually permitted. And they actually drill horizontally, and then they turn and go vertical into the formation so that they can spread the plume out a little bit more than just a single well, which ADM is using. It's got this really nice little cloverleaf formation. You can see the blue outline is their 2-year CO2 plume where they expect it. Orange is the 5-year. Purple is the 10-year, and then this is the 22 and the 70-year because I believe they're going to cease injection after 10 years. At least that's their current plan. You can also see on this map is where they have some of their far field monitoring wells so they can monitor the pressure. You've got your underground source of drinking water monitoring well, which is right next to the injection site. And not shown on this is they have a whole bunch of other tests and things that they're going to do. Not part of the permit, but they're trying out a lot of new techniques so that they can hopefully provide these back to EPA for future use. Anybody want to venture to guess why they have this funny little cloverleaf formation? Anybody? Well, Tom, you already know. You don't count. The reason is they couldn't get the property rights to inject the CO2 on some of the land up here. The people who own it said, no, you're not doing it. So what they did is they made the wells kind of go out to the side and 2 to the south so that they could direct the plume to the south because they couldn't get the pore space rights on this farm up here. So I thought that was pretty cool. So they're able to kind of move the plume where they need to. And I mean, this one's a little different from ADM. ADM's injecting directly underneath their own site and only touching the pore space and some of the surrounding areas just a little bit. This is completely under the public, completely under privately owned homes. And actually, this is their injection well, but right here is actually a fairly big farm. The FutureGen Alliance has been very vocal and getting out and doing outreach with everybody in the community, but still, you just can't get that one person to agree to it. So today, it's just a cornfield. I mean, after all this, you talk about all the geology and what CCS looks like and what it's going to do to the local community. This is it. This is where the pad's going to go, right back there. It's just a cornfield. So That's what I got. In summary, very strong regulations for developing CCS. We want to make sure that we get this right so that when we do start to see these projects come up in the future and we do start to see geologic storage, we know what we're doing. We know how to adequately protect the drinking water. We know how to avoid any type of seismic issues. The 50-year PISC is something that a lot of folks are concerned about, but hopefully some of these permits do give some certainty towards it, show some methods of insurance and setting up the trust fund, which FutureGen did. Hopefully it gives a little bit of certainty moving forward. And we still are a little bit concerned about the Subpart RR and UU developments going forward. So with that, thank you. Any questions? I think you had one
I
earlier.
have one, only because I'm going to, well, probably two, one of which I'm going to probably expose my ignorance a little bit. But you referenced a couple of times about the groundwater remediation look like for CO. What does it look like for CO2? Or are you suggesting that it's the process itself, it's not the CO2 that would be what needs to be remediated, but something other than that that would be part of the process?
So you mean if there is groundwater contamination, how would you remediate it?
Yeah, and how would you know if it's CO2? Is that qualify as contamination? Again, it's probably an elementary question that you're...
Right. So with each of the projects, they have a monitoring well that's located essentially right next to the site. Mm-hmm. And they drill down and they go into the lowermost source of drinking water, which would be the first place that you would see any type of breakthrough of CO2 that comes up. Mm-hmm. If there is, and this is starting to get a little bit outside my area of expertise, but if they do detect any change in the groundwater chemistry, they have a remediation response plan, and they show exactly step by step what they would do. And I believe it includes there's some initial treatment of the groundwater, and if it gets to the point where they can't remediate it further, I think they do provide the community with like alternate sources of drinking water. But to be honest, that's like my basic rudimentary understanding of it, and I would have to go back and actually read through the response plan to see what they're planning to do.
Any further questions?
Hi. In the past, I think the biggest resistance to, sequestration projects has been public resistance. So moving forward, how do you plan on alleviating the public's resistance to allow projects to continue?
You know, it's funny. We have this training program every year called the Research Experience in Sequestration. We host it down in, actually Southern Company has been hosting it the last year. And last week they had a session on communication and public outreach, and I left the day before we had that. So a little unfortunate I got the question, but that's okay. I know specifically with ADM, they are the largest, I believe they're the largest employer in Decatur, Illinois. It's a massive project. Massive company, massive plant, employs most of the people in the community. They're also associated with the University of Illinois, which is part of the partnership, the regional partnership there, which is the Midwest Geologic Sequestration Partnership, and the Illinois State Geologic Service. Between the three of them, ADM, University of Illinois, and ISGS, they have a very, very active outreach program in the community. Any time that they were planning on doing it, they held public meetings, they hosted everybody, they wanted everybody to come in, and ADM is really putting themselves out there by putting it directly underneath their own property. And that's one of the big things that they want to communicate with the public in the area is if they didn't think it was safe, they wouldn't be putting it underneath their property. And that's actually an area that they're planning to expand. I mean, right now it's just an open field, but they've got plans to do some more there. So for them, it's really about getting ahead of the curve, going out and talking to the public, telling them what they're doing, showing them all of their response plans, making sure they know who to call. And everybody in the community knows Scott McDonald, the guy who's working on the project. So really, it's just all about being upfront with everybody, talking to them early and explaining why they're taking the risk. One thing I didn't mention on this is they actually qualify for the 45Q tax credit. So it's just came out, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, but it pays operators $20 per ton to inject CO2 into geologic formations, and I believe it's $10 a ton for enhanced oil recovery. For ADM, it costs them $8 to run the system per ton. So they're actually going to be making a good bit of money on this project.
Yeah, I had a question. I guess it was
Sure.
Follow up on Mike Atwell with Solvay. I guess Mike, question is, what is the economics for doing this? Because, you know, it takes a big subsidy by the DOE, it takes a big subsidy by the government, and every presentation I've seen on the, you know, the viability of carbon capture and sequestration really demands that you valorize the CO2, and that just putting it down a hole is never going to be a viable option. And, you know, I just want to know what your thoughts are on that, and you know, why are people taking the time to do something here that just doesn't seem like it's going to be ever an economically viable option?
Okay, sure. They do have plans under Class 6 for using enhanced oil recovery sites for storage. So that does have a little bit of a dovetail and application. And I agree with you. Right now, it's not economic. That's, I think, what it comes down to. Most of our demonstration projects, we do see some measure of enhanced oil recovery because they simply need the rate recovery for the CO2. They're very expensive projects, and it pushes up the cost of electricity from those plants substantially. Part of what we're doing at the Department of Energy is doing everything we can to reduce the cost reduce the cost of capture and reduce the risk of storage. So hopefully, in the future, under state plans, coal can still remain an option that anybody can choose. And if we bring the cost down far enough, then they can be in line with some of the other technology options that we see. We're also, it's likely that EPA is not just going to stop with coal, but they might continue on with gas. And we hope to not flood all of the EOR fields right now, but we do want to get some of those early projects and get some early experience in putting it in these formations for the future so that we know how everything works. And most importantly, we want to make sure that we're way ahead of the curve on the regulation and we have enough information to provide just to make sure that we can keep everything cost effective. But you're right, it's more expensive than not doing it right now, and it's a little hard to believe that sometime in the future we're going to be using geologic storage. But we want to make sure that it is an option.
Any more questions?
How do I do on time?
Very good. Right on schedule. Thank you, Jordan. We have reached our point for our coffee and refreshment break. So if you would be kind enough to visit the exhibitors' booths while you're upstairs again, that would be terrific. We will reconvene at 3:30 for our next session.